Welcome to Bitcoin with Jake. Today we're speaking with Eric Yakes. Welcome, Eric.
What's up, Jake?
Yeah, I'm very keen to get into this. I've done my homework and I finished your book last night. So, what an awesome journey that is. For the listeners out there, could you give us a brief update as to, or an overview, shall we say, of the projects you're involved in at the moment, and of course, introduce your book. And what we're going to do today is dive into a bit of your background and understand what brought you to today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I published the book back in June, and then I'll save a lot of that for discussion around the background. But what I'm involved in right now is I've spent a lot of time over the past 6-8 months just figuring out what I wanted to do in this industry, and the book really helped me form a strong industry thesis for where I think things are going, and how I can add value, and there's a lot of different things I'm interested in. I'm interested in, the media side of this industry, as well as building a business that's, adding value in a much more tangible way. And so that's going to be more on the financial side, because that's my background, and it's going to be in asset management. And I'm currently under discussions to form a partnership around that. And nothing I can speak in too much detail about yet, but it's definitely to help people manage their Bitcoin.
Cool. And so we can get into, I guess, like the future towards the end of the conversation.
Cool.
What I'd love to learn about is, so if finance was your background, is that what you studied at university? And going back even before then, someone who's studied or worked in the finance industry obviously had some interest in business prior to that. Like, what was it like growing up for you? Was that something that, your parents influenced you into, or it just came naturally, or what was that process like?
Cool. Yeah, I've never spoken about this on a podcast yet, so
Right.
I'm excited to talk about this. I'd say this is one of the biggest differentiators between me and most people I kind of meet who go into the areas that I've gone into. When I was a little kid growing up, I was kind of a shithead. I didn't work very hard. I worked hard at things I cared about, but that definitely wasn't school. And so when I was younger, I liked sports. And when I hit puberty, I liked girls, and it was a lot of stuff around that when I was younger. I think I graduated high school with a pretty low GPA. I think it was like a 2.8 or something like that, because I just never really spent time in school. It was something that never really interested me all that much. And I think with what drew me into finance and all of that, it wasn't anything immediate. So it's kind of funny. I think that so my dad was a doctor, and he wanted me to be a doctor pretty badly. And I never really put thought into what my career is going to be. And then it was around like my junior year of high school. I was like, crap, I got to start thinking about college and things like that. And I did something I didn't really want to think about given my work ethic in school. And I started thinking about what I really wanted to do. And just kind of out the gate, being a doctor was never something that was very appealing to me. So I kind of wrote that off very quickly. And I was like, I don't really know what I want to do, but I just kind of started at, I started on the baseline, and I was like, okay, well, let's start thinking about what I might be good at. And then it was around my senior year, I started taking like personality tests, just trying to figure it out. And, really what kind of like sparked my ambition and made me want to grow up a bit and start actually pursuing something of purpose in life was it all started. I had this lacrosse coach, and his name was Don Knobloch, and he impacted me in a really big way. We were on this trip down in Florida, and it was this traveling tournament. We won our state championship. So we went down to Florida for like the national championship, and me and the whole team were down there. And I just happened to know this girl from like middle school who lived in Tampa Bay, Florida. And we went out partying with her and her friends one night before our games. And then the next morning we, woke up late, me and the guy I was staying with, and we showed up late to our first game. So
Classic.
Yeah. So he sat us on, said, you guys can't play in this game. And that hurt, because this was a pretty big deal. This was one of the biggest tournaments that I went to. It was a very, very competitive tournament. And then at the end of the game, he had all the parents and all the kids, and he sits us all down, and he just chewed my ass in front of everybody and told me how much of a, shithead I was. Or can I curse on this?
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Cool. Okay. So yeah, he chewed me pretty hard. And that was like the real first wake up call for me. And and I came back from that trip and I was like, you know what, he's dead right. And, what is it that you want to do? And I started thinking about a lot of that stuff more and more. And then I got a lot more ambitious and I started putting together a plan of, things I'm genuinely interested in. And it was around that same time, my senior year, I found the
Sorry,
book
and so for
Capitalism and
context, senior year is 18, roughly.
yeah, 18. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah. I found the book Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman. And that really got me hooked. I think, just in terms of, it's hard for me to explain really what it was or anything, but I know that I got interested in economics pretty early. And then I was taking personality tests, and everything that was coming back for my type of personality was always, like investment banking or management consulting type career. So that's just where I started. And I went off to college and, I came up with a plan. I was like, okay, I want to work in the private equity industry. And I was much more, I was younger, I was much more naive back then, and my goals were very different from what they ultimately evolved to. But, back then it was kind of, the idea was that it's a competitive industry. It's if you're going into the business world, then getting into competitive finance is probably the best way to cut your teeth. If you work for a private equity fund, then you're the guy who writes the check of the company, which means, the buck stops at you. You're the last guy in charge. Nobody else is in charge except for the guy who writes a check. And that's something that I wanted to be a part of. When you're at the highest level, you're the capital allocator and you make all the highest level decisions and you think in, broad strategy. And if you can get into private equity, then you can do that at a pretty young age. And I think that sets you up really well for the business world. So, from that, those were some of my good motivations. And then back then the other motivations were I wanted to make a bunch of money. And,
Fair
and
enough.
that was, yeah. And, as you get older and as you start realizing, how world works and what makes you happy, and you grow and you mature a bit more, I think that changed pretty significantly for me. And before I even graduated college, but nonetheless, I saw it as like a really good place to start out my career. And, so starting my freshman year, I was studying, I double majored in finance and economics. And I, kind of flipped the switch. So like given my past when I was in high school, my parents were like very concerned whether or not I was, going to drop out of college or something. And then, and I flipped the switch and I graduated with like a 3.9. And, my freshman year was probably my hardest because I just really didn't know how to study very well going into college. And it was something that was pretty unfamiliar to me, and doing that in like a more rigorous manner. So I started to, I got like a 3.4 GPA. I remember my freshman year, that was probably my first semester. And I think that was the hardest I'd worked in, out of any of the semesters in college. But once you figure out how to study and you do it efficiently and you learn how to do it right, then I was like, okay, this college stuff isn't all that hard. But I remember freshman year, I was kind of like, wow, can I actually even pull off like a 4.0? I don't really know. But then I pulled it off. And then after that, I was able to get involved in a lot of other things to make my resume pretty competitive for this job market. And that was definitely a grind. The school I was coming out of was like non-target for a lot of the interviews I was doing. And, but I did a lot of networking on my own. And I think that was, in hindsight, I'm really glad that I started off at a non-target school because it forced me to learn how to network really well at a young age and how to grind and how to hustle. And a lot of kids, if you go to, an Ivy League, then all these firms are typically recruiting on campus. So there's not much you actually have to do to get in front of people. And so that was one of the skills that I think was really helpful developing at a younger age, was just learning how to hustle your way into things. And yeah, so I did a bunch of interviews and I didn't get the top jobs I wanted, but I got like my number 3 job out of college, which was good enough for me. And then I like, okay, let's keep grinding. And then I got into the field and I learned a lot about business. I learned a lot about finance. I learned about how companies operate, what makes them valuable, where they run into different problems. And I started off at a management consulting firm doing that. We were kind of in a niche area though, because we were doing corporate restructuring. So we had like the operational strategic business side of things we would do. But we also had kind of like an investment banking tilt to a lot of what we did. When I say corporate restructuring, that means we specialize in, helping companies that are either like going into bankruptcy or they're undergoing a significant challenge. And when you're in those scenarios, there's usually a major financial implication involved. So you can't just have like a typical management consulting firm. They're dealing with like a healthy company. And, if Kellogg goes and hires a management consulting firm, like, we want to launch a new product, give us a strategy or something. That's like a pure strategy business type project that you work on. In our situation, it's like this company might be going under. we hire you guys to step in and take control. And that means, not only understanding how the business operates and how to turn that around, but also, okay, well, we need to figure out what assets you guys have and what we need to sell to like get the financial situation where we need it to be, et cetera, things like that. So I got really good at like cutting my teeth in challenging business environments, that job was the job that I wanted to tee myself up to get into private equity, because in private equity, it's looking at companies like that a lot. There's a lot of different areas of private equity, but a large proportion of it's that in the area I was interested in, specialize in that. So that was a good way for me to get the skills. And then, those jobs were pretty long hours. So throughout that process at my first firm, I was setting myself up for private equity, and that was like my end goal this whole time. And, there was a lot of like work after hours, teaching myself different things that I need to get into the industry. And then after working there for about 2.5 years, I started going out and campaigning to get, a job at a private equity fund and reaching out to different people I know in the industry and talking to recruiters, things like that. And then I got a job at one based out of Denver, where I am, and it was perfect, and it was a lot of things that I liked and wanted, and I accepted it. And then that was kind of my end goal, right? So when I was in college, that was the goal since like freshman year. So I was like, okay, like you finally did it. Now you just got to get really good at this job. And like back then, my plan was to work at the fund for a couple of years and then go back to grad school, because that's kind of the traditional path. You go back to grad school, you meet a bunch of other people who have MBAs, but I wanted to get an MBA and a JD. You can do like 3-year programs at some schools, and you can get both. Just because having a legal knowledge is, I think, really important in any area of business as well. If you want to play the game, then you got to know the rules. And that was kind of my rationale. And, I was trying to target all the top schools, and I was pretty ambitious about that. And, it was right around the time that I was thinking about making that jump. So I'd been at the private equity firm, for a little over a year at this point. And I was like, okay, it's time to like start preparing yourself for grad school and taking all the tests and doing all the interviews and stuff. And I was having a pretty hard time with that, just because everything, they try to dig in deeply and figure out, who you are and what your long-term goals are. And, back then it was just pretty standard. I was like, I want to work in the private equity industry. I want to be a capital allocator. And it was kind of that process made me realize, like, I don't know if I really even want to go to grad school. It seemed just so unappealing to me, but I was like, oh, it's part of this plan that you put together. You need to go do that. And then, I was working at the fund at the same time, and I was working pretty long hours. And I went through this whole, I was working on these deals for like 6 months. I hadn't seen a lot of people, a lot of my friends. I wasn't socializing very much. It's pretty much just nonstop work. I was gaining weight. And then once we finished those deals, some of them fell through. And that was something that was pretty disappointing to me. And once that happened, I got a little bit more free time to start to think to myself. And I was like, okay, like, this is taking a big cost on your life. Is this all worth it? And that's what started to open my mind up to other options. And then, in the background, I had my Bitcoin journey going on. So the way that I kind of looked at everything throughout this whole period was like, economics is kind of my hobby. But, finance is my profession. It was just like economics was something I was always drawn to. So like when I had free time, I was reading about that. And eventually when I got led to Bitcoin, I initially just wrote it off based on my financial education. During this period, I got like a CFA charter. And like when you're taught to like think in those types of frameworks, it's very hard to fit Bitcoin into all that. And so I rejected it. I said it was a speculative asset with no fundamental value. And then a good friend of mine who I worked with, he kind of kept pushing it on me. He's like, and he had like a tech background when I was at my first company. And he was just like, look, dude, this thing's really cool. It does all this cool stuff. It's this new technology. And he was kind of pitching it from like the technology angle. And that didn't resonate well with me. I was just like, look, man, it could be a really cool technology, but if I can't measure its value, then I don't know how I could ever invest in it. I don't know what it's worth. But he kind of kept harping on it and like pushing on me. I was like, all right, buddy, I'll take a look at it. And then I can't remember exactly what it was, but I came across some sort of, it was like a forum post or something. And it was getting in, this was like when I was first really actually taking, a few hours to like really dig into it. And it was talking about how it's like an alternative to like central banking in some form. And then that got the gears turning. And that got me really interested because I was well aware of all the issues with central banking. And my financial thesis up until this point was this is how the world works, and that's just how it works. And it's like either like, you participate in the economy the way it's structured, or what else are you going to do? And I'd spent a decent amount of time, and before that point, kind of thinking through where's this all going to end? How's it going to go wrong? And there's a point when I was looking at, like the Japanese equity markets, and they were, they were effectively nationalizing them. The government took it so far. I mean, you think about what happened during the pandemic. The Fed didn't just buy, treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. They also started buying corporate debt, municipal debt. They started opening up all these international swap lines. Like, they got into all these other asset classes that were outside of their mandate because it was a crisis, and you can pretty much do anything you want during a crisis. So Japan was doing that to the extent that they were buying their equity markets, and they're doing that in a very material way. I think, and I could be totally wrong about this number, but it was, my memory was that it was around like 25% of, if you looked at like their primary Nikkei index, I think it was like 25% of it was effectively nationalized by the amount of like central bank purchases back then. And I was just like, this is ridiculous. Like, this has to end some way. And I was thinking about trying to find ways to like short different Japanese equities. And I, ultimately where I got to back then was, I don't really know. I don't really know how it ends. And I, in fact, didn't end up taking any sort of position on that. And it was soon after that I started digging more into Bitcoin and seeing that was an alternative to central banking. And that's when I got really interested. So I started reading a lot more about it. And that was kind of, late 2016, early 2017. And then, the run up and everything started happening. And I was reading into, all the other ones. And I was like, okay, well, what's this Ethereum thing? And what does it do? And, what's the difference between these consensus algorithms? Oh, well, if this one's different than Bitcoin, then it must be an improvement on it. It must be some sort of innovation people are working off. I mean, you go, and I went through like, all those details, and I wasn't like a hardcore Bitcoiner out the gate. There's a lot of things that made me think, these other ones could serve a purpose a lot better. And I think it wasn't until like 2018, 2019 when I got a bit deeper that I started to, realize how frothy all of that was. And it's just marketing tactics. And I just wasn't deep enough to really understand it initially. And that brought me back to like the roots of, the general purpose of what's going on. And so bring that all back to when I was at the private equity fund and I was considering alternatives. I had this building in my mind the whole time. And I think that it was something that always seemed crazy to me. I was always like, well, I can be an investor in this stuff, but, jumping into the industry and like working in the industry, that would just be, that's a kind of crazy thing. I've already invested so much into my career at this point. I put together this whole plan. I can't just like throw that all away. And then, but once I got like a little bit more personal at a certain point, when I kind of like asked myself, I was like, you're making all these sacrifices in life for this career. Like, is this really what you want in grad school? Doesn't seem that appealing. Like, yeah, if I look, 10, 20 years into the future and I stay in this, career path, where am I going to be? And I was at the point where, I was in my mid 20s. So like I got to the point where I wanted, and my future had a lot more definable features to it. So I could really see into the future and say like, okay, it's going to be X amount of years till I get to this role. Then I look at the guys I know who are in that role. And then I see like what their lifestyles are like. And I'm like, okay, X amount of years until this role. Okay, here's the point where you'll be free enough to, own your own time, do what you want, and make the own decisions that you want. And that's a pretty far ways down the road. And that was one aspect of it. The other thing too, is that what you typically see in the industry is, well, one thing that I realized pretty quickly is when you're playing other people's games, then you inevitably spend in like an inordinate amount of time trying to rise their hierarchies. And at the end of the day, that made just entrepreneurship so much more appealing to me. And I didn't really know it yet, but I started to realize how hard it's going to be to actually grind your way, particularly in these ultra competitive industries of people who are very, well established, and their whole game is to have as many people that they can have working for them without, giving up ownership. And it's also an industry where your exit options of like going and starting your own thing, it's a lot harder because it's all resume based. So you have to grind it for these guys in the first place if you're even going to get there in the first place. So all those things that I was thinking through, I was just like, that's not super appealing. And then like the idea came into my head, and I was kind of like, well, you could do something in Bitcoin. And that was one big piece of it. And that got me thinking about that. And then on the other side of things, it was more like at a personal level. I was thinking about what I was really good at. And I was like, one of my really good friends used to always say this: you can't compete against people who love what they're doing. And that really always resonated with me because, you know, I realized that I didn't love what I was doing and I wasn't spending all my free time thinking about it. I was thinking about a lot of other stuff. And I asked myself, like, what am I good at? And the framework of thinking was like, what am I good at? What do I enjoy? Because oftentimes there's a bit of a distinction between those two things. And then, you know, what does the world need? And with the what I'm good at, what I enjoyed, I was like, well, one thing that kind of differentiated me from this industry, and I talked about this a little bit in the McCormack interview, but uh, you know, a lot of people in this area are very analytical. They're very like shrewd businessmen and very valuable skill, really good for that area. And that was something I could do and I was capable at, and I could, you know, do all that. And that's something I actually really enjoyed. But there was a whole other side of like, I like having frank discussions. I like being open and honest with people. I like being more laid back. I like having a sense of humor. There wasn't enough humanity in this industry for me. And I always wanted to have some sort of like media side to what I was doing. And I had no idea what that really even was. But I wanted to educate people. I wanted to make jokes. I wanted to tell my story to the world. And, you know, it was funny, like the very first idea that popped into my head when I was thinking through some of that stuff was like, well, you could like be like a comedian or something. And I thought that'd be cool. I was like, yeah, but you know, that sounds like a hilarious lifestyle.
Like a Bitcoin comedian.
Like a Bitcoin comedian. And that wasn't even quite there yet. You know, this is like at the very beginning.
That will appear at some point for sure.
But, you know, that was one of the first things I was thinking through. And then, you know, as I thought about it more, I was kind of like, okay, well, I don't know if I'd want to be like completely that, because I care a lot about, you know, being serious and, you know, really actually educating people and getting deep into doing analysis, things like that, really understanding how things work. So I started thinking from first principles about all these different things, from that framework of, you know, what I'm good at, what I enjoy, and what the world needs. And where I ultimately got to before I decided like, okay, I'm going to quit my job was, I had that framework in my mind, and I was at a point in my career where, you know, it's a pretty demanding job. And once I was in my head, I like couldn't get it out because I was spending all my time just like thinking through that. And I'd be at work and I'd be like, oh, like, you know, this doesn't even matter. Like there's totally this other path I could go. So I decided, I was like, okay, well, you know, I could give myself like a few years runway and I could get really deep into this. And, so I, you know, sold my place. I moved in with my mom and we put together a plan. I said like, okay, if I go the next like 2 to 3 years, I'm sure I can get this plan together in the next like, you know, year and get something like tangible put together. And then I can go after all this. And, you know, one day I just kind of decided, okay, I'm going to do it. And then I did. And then, you know, the first like, you know, 6 months of it all was me just taking some time off and reconnecting with people and getting back in shape and getting my life back into balance. I think one thing I learned, the first like, you know, 6 years out of school when I was working really hard was that I don't want my life to fall out of balance. And I don't want to pick a career path that's going to make it so, unless it's something that I truly, truly, truly believe in. Otherwise, it's just not worth the cost for me. And this is kind of the area where I think I'm going to figure out exactly what that balance is for me. But so yeah, just getting back into balance and reconnecting with people was huge. And my overall life just like felt so much more improved. I mean, I couldn't tell you how happy I was when I first made the decision. But then it was kind of time to get to work. And then I was like, all right, buddy, like, let's figure out how to piece this all together. And that was hard because I was trying to figure out, you know, I had this huge wall staring in front of me of like, you know, all this insurmountably high thing that I'm trying to go for back then. And I had to put together a plan.
Did you know you were going to write a book when you were facing this wall? No. Okay.
No plan at all to write a book. That's probably one of the funniest things about the whole situation.
Cool.
Yeah. I just knew that in the way that it ultimately evolved into a book was I broke down problems into things that I know I could benefit from immediately, that I wouldn't regret spending time on in the future. Because I was on like a time constraint here. So I really had to think about exactly how I was going to go about doing it and be thoughtful. And so I started off like the first big thing that I wanted. I was like, okay, time to get really deep into Bitcoin. And I put together like a curriculum for myself on, you know, just economics, the history of economics, different financial readings, you know, all the different Bitcoin readings that I wanted to learn. And back then there weren't as many, but I mean, there were more than I was actually aware of. I wasn't somebody who was like,
so when was this, Eric, roughly?
So this was like beginning of 2020, end of 2019.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, so when I started doing that, for on the Bitcoin piece, it's kind of funny in hindsight, just like how much stuff that I'm aware of now in the industry that I wasn't even aware of back then when I first started off on all this. But I just kind of found the books that I'd encountered, and and I read them, and so that was like Bitcoin Standard, Mastering Bitcoin. I had somebody recommend me a book that's never recommended that I think is actually really good. It was written back in, I think it was 2014 by a group of Princeton professors. It's Bitcoin and Cryptocurrency Technologies. One Princeton professor, and then I think a group of other academics. But it's actually a great book, and I think it kind of frames things in a different way for people. I read that, and that was extremely helpful to me because they go into like the industry history a lot more in that too, which is nice. And then
What was the title? Sorry.
Bitcoin and Cryptocurrency Technologies.
Yeah, I've not heard that either.
Yeah, people don't talk about it very much, but I thought it's a slog. It's a full textbook, so I think that's
Yeah.
probably why.
Nice.
But that was very helpful. And then the kind of the final one in terms of like the Bitcoin content that I wanted to get into was Jimmy Song's Programming Bitcoin book, and that was a hard one because I came from a financial background. I didn't understand tech very well at all, and so I was like, okay, if I want to get through this book, then I have to teach myself Python. And that actually wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. I just got like a beginner book for super cheap and just taught myself. And then I jumped into Jamie Song's book, cranked that out in like a month and a half, I think. And then after that, that was pretty much just like a lot of economics reading, which was a lot more, easier for me because I had a background in all that stuff. And then there was kind of a certain point along the way, somewhere in that mix, where I was like, okay, you're gonna have to like write all this stuff out. So I was just taking notes on all this stuff, making sure I understood it really well. I was like, no, you should put together like a series of writings and come together with a really core understanding of what you think about the industry. And that's where like the whole idea around the book kind of started there. And I started putting together all these writings, and I was just thinking through what I believed, what I didn't believe. And it's just such a good way to learn. You have to write things out because so quickly something that's clear in your head, the second you start writing it out,
I couldn't agree
realize,
more on that. I write a newsletter every week, and it's just an excellent way to distill your own thoughts. And if
yep,
you can't write I take 3 bits of content I've consumed, and I write like 3 short paragraphs about what I thought about it. And if you sometimes it just writes itself, and other times
right,
it just doesn't, and it means you don't understand, and you kind of have to
yep,
go back. And it's funny. It's as soon as I find this a lot. We'll dive back in, but context makes such a difference, right? So as soon as you've got a subject that you're really actually interested in, then you study the shit out of it. And the best way to understand that is then to actually write an essay or write an article or write something about it. Because once you've done it,
right,
you then truly understand what you're thinking. Because otherwise,
yep,
your thoughts are just all over the place, right? You're up in the
right.
ether, and you're like, how do I put this all in one place? And when you start putting it in one place, it doesn't make sense. But over time, you obviously manage to eventually you write a book. It's
Right,
amazing.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
apparently that's where it leads. Like, yeah, that's exactly. I mean, that's exactly what it is. I think that like anybody who's whether you're trying to get into this industry or whatever it is that you're doing, um, if it has any sort of complexity towards it, or if you're trying to communicate and educate people on it, I think you got to be writing it out. And maybe that writing never shows the light of day. Like even in my general workflow that I do, if I have like an important meeting or something, then I write out my points. I'll like write out the meeting in my head, and
Mhm.
and that's something that like sits on my computer. It never goes to anybody, but it just really helps me understand things.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, and that's pretty much what it was. And I started writing, and then really quickly into that, I was like, okay, I'll start with a couple essays, and I started writing, and then and I was like, okay, well, maybe I created like this core body of work that really I believe in for what this industry is, why it's valuable, and where it's going. And then getting into that, I was like, okay, there's so much I want to write here. This could effectively be a book. And then it popped up in my head, and I was like, okay, well, that actually sounds like a pretty good way to start off in the industry. It's like if you were one of the guys who wrote the book, and I'd read some of the books, and there's great books in the industry, but I was like, there's so much room for all this. I was like, I've read all this stuff, and I don't see anything that really like puts this all together in one place for somebody, particularly people with like my background. And right, there's all these different people coming to this industry from all these different areas, and different narratives and different structures of information resonate with them differently.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, being a financial guy, there definitely wasn't anything that sold me. I mean, the closest thing was like the Bitcoin standard, but that gets super theoretical. Like guys in finance just don't really give a shit about the theoretical stuff. They want like, here's a tangible value proposition. Here's hard facts. I don't really care about your opinion on things. Walk me through the facts. And that's kind of what I wanted to focus on with my writing, is, I wanted to write the book that I wish I'd been given when I first started off in all this, because I had to go to all these far corners, find all these resources, teach myself all these different things, when I wish I could have just been given my book, and then that probably could have gotten me up and running pretty quick. Not saying that the extra knowledge I gained from everything else I read wasn't incredibly valuable, but at least as like a starting point, if I had my book, I try to like reference all the different sources that I use for knowledge. And
it's very well referenced. Yeah.
And because like that's what I wanted. I wanted to find a book that would really bring me to all the different areas, so I could read my book and I get to the end and I could say, okay, this all makes a lot of sense to me now. I'm super interested. I want to go more in depth. I'm going to go read into all this other stuff. Yeah. So that's kind of what it was. And honestly, I think some of the success of the book, in hindsight, because I wrote this thing and I was like, I was very confident in my work, but I had no idea about book writing or, being an author.
It's classic. Who knows, right?
Yeah. It wasn't really my goal to like sell a lot of copies. That wasn't really the purpose. It was more, I did it for me. And I was like, if people find value in it, then that's great. But I kind of just more did it for me, and a great way to like start and understand my thoughts. And I went about it like some of my favorite books, were books that like weren't very heavily marketed books. Those were the kind of books that always attracted me. And when I kind of had this thesis, I was like, I don't know if that's like the right way, focusing on what you like necessarily, but it was more just kind of did it for myself. I was like, okay, you know what? I don't really want to like market this thing very heavily or anything. I'm just going to put it out there and I'm going to talk about my thoughts and ideas online. And, if people like it, then great. And that's kind of the goal. Like I didn't write it because I wanted to be an author in the industry or like make money or anything. And then it was really cool. There's some like really smart guys. There's this guy, one of the founders of the WTF happened in 1971 website, Heavily Armed Clown. His Anon account. He was the first guy to like reach out to me, and it was like I was getting like debates with different people online about different Bitcoin topics on things. That's kind of like I think how I first got noticed, and he noticed it. And I had like drafts of my book posted on my website for the first like 2 months before I published it, and I was just like trying to source feedback from different people on it. And he like read all of it. He like read my book of some random dude with like I think I had 30 followers on Twitter or something, and read the whole thing. And he was just like, dude, this is awesome. You should come on my podcast. And I was like, sick, man. And like, he was like the first guy who kind of got me started. And then everything stepped from there. But with the,
so I assume, Eric, that was like roughly mid 2020 when you released it.
Yeah, it was kind of like, I went live with things. Like I had this like draft version of all of it. And I was so I finished writing the book in February, 2020. And then final draft. And then I like give it to an editor and go through a few iterations with him. Had a great editor. I had a guy who was kind of had a background in like, more the Keynesian side of things, very liberal guy, rode, bicycles in Vermont. And that's exactly who I wanted to like critique my book because, talked about the alternative theories and he was great. And then you go through a design process and everything. So like kind of when that whole process was going on, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to put these drafts up online and I'm going to source feedback. And I have my own personal network of, colleagues I used to work with and things like that. And I kind of got different demographics from different areas that I thought would be, the book could be beneficial to. And when you get their understanding from like people had high understanding of finance, people had a very low understanding of finance. And there was like a few for like the people in like the Bitcoin world that I had to take a look at it there. I just didn't know anybody in the industry yet. So, there's a few people who helped me and like, I didn't ask them to like read the whole damn thing. That's super time consuming. But I kind of, I knew a little bit about them. I asked them to like read a couple of chapters and there's some guys that took a look at a few things for me, which was nice. And yeah, so like going through that process was kind of how I first started to get myself out there. And then I launched the book just before the Bitcoin conference in June 2020. And I was just talking to a bunch of people at a conference, telling them I wrote a book. And then it was, I saw, BTC Sessions at the conference. He was walking by me and I was like, hey, what's up, man? Like, I'm Eric. Jesse Berger is like one of the authors who I was talking to beforehand. He wrote the Magic Internet Money. Really, really good guy, really awesome guy. And I was like, hey, Jesse Berger told me I should talk to you. I wrote this book and, yeah, just want to let you know that. And he was, he just like stopped immediately. He was like, dude, I'll buy your book right now. And he like bought my book and just like the nicest guy ever. And then, conference ends. And then like a few weeks after that, he starts posting a bunch of pictures on Twitter of like, my book and, all these excerpts from it. And he was kind of like blowing it up for me a bit. And then that's kind of how my initial following really started to accumulate.
Wow.
And then everything stemmed from there. Then it's like Bitcoin Magazine reached out to me. I got involved with them, and then conferences wanted me to come talk, and then so on and so forth. And then the biggest thing was back in February when Peter McCormack brought me on. And
I watched
that's
that
pretty
interview,
much a
actually.
journey.
It was great. Yeah, well done.
Yeah, Peter's a man. I appreciate that, man. Thanks. It was
You got your real Bedford shirt on, which is great.
I know, and it's funny because literally I was opening the mail 10 minutes before I hopped on this podcast and it came through. So I took my shirt off. I was like, I'm wearing the Bedford shirt.
Yeah, wear it. No, well done.
Yeah.
Oh, Eric, what a story. I'm
yeah.
loving it. So I want to just jump in at this point and
Yep.
so first of all, say well done. So how old are you now, if you don't mind me asking?
28.
28. Look at that. So you told me a story about your lacrosse coach, Don, 10 years ago saying, you're a dead shit. Like you went out and got pissed with your mates.
Yeah.
You're late at the game. You're A, on the bench, not playing. And B, I'm going to now rinse you in front of like all the friends and family that are here. And
right.
What a decade it's been. I mean, you've just taken me through, so much of the way that you think about the world and what you did in order to get to today. And I mean, I frankly don't know many people who've written books as good as yours by the age of 28. Like it's epic. There are sections of it that are really helpful and aren't part of other kind of the standard Bitcoin reading list, to your point, which I really enjoyed. Like understanding cryptography better. So elliptic curves. I didn't understand that before. And it's quite a simple concept when you lay it out, but until you've actually gone and done the work, you don't really understand, right? Something that to me is shining through here is a phrase you've used a couple of times, which is like, I taught myself. And I think this is actually something that is very relevant to a lot of people in Bitcoin, because there's no Bitcoin MBA, right? It doesn't exist.
Right.
You've got to go out, you've got to find all the content, and you've got to consume it yourself. And then you've got to work out what you think about it. And one of the reasons that we're all getting together and talking about this subject is trying to find someone somewhere who says this actually won't work, and here's a very good reason why. And even with all of the hours that all these people have put in fact, Bitcoin's getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And so the kind of the doomsday it's going to die and all the wealth you've got stored in it doesn't exist is more and more unlikely as this process happens. But like, I'd love to just hear a bit more about, like, just in retrospect, think about Don. How did you feel on that day? And like, was that perhaps one of the best life lessons you've ever been taught? Like, how did it make you feel? And this process of like picking yourself up and saying, okay, I got to take responsibility for this myself. And this is actually very similar to the responsibility that a Bitcoiner takes when they self-custody their wealth. You're actually taking responsibility for what's yours. If you lose this, it's gone. But a lot of that mentality, I think, is present in lots of Bitcoiners. And actually, Bitcoin Sessions I interviewed yesterday, what a great story he has. And it's very similar. He was in education and he realized he could teach people. And that's why he started making YouTube videos, because he was a visual learner. So just step back to that day that Don's like rinsed you in front of all your mates. Like, how did you feel? And what do you think you really learned from that? And is it like just pick yourself up and get going? Like, what characteristic did you build out of that process?
I think, that's a really good thing to hit on. I feel like, he cut me to my core. And that doesn't really happen to me very often. That was probably like the first time, I'd say, because I was just like this really cocky teenager, right? And nobody could ever really get through to me because I just like didn't give a shit about anything. And yeah, he was like the first. It wasn't my parents, it wasn't any of my friends, it was him. He was like first guy that like really got through to me. And I, yeah, just, it really shook me to my core. It made me understand like the reality of who I was, and that I didn't really care about anything in life, and that affects other people. And that, your life does matter to other people, and the actions that you take do matter. And you need to do things that are good. And otherwise you can end up being a pretty unhappy person. And uh and that's pretty much what it was. I think that if there's anything, just thinking about it right now, if there's anything that I think I've noticed since that point, it's that people that I've always gravitated towards as mentors in like the business world, primarily the business world, have always been the bosses who would like, rip into me, because like they're always the bosses who could really get me to anything that I'm very stubborn about. They're the ones who get through to me on it. I had a boss, Carl, at my first job out of college. And one of the things that I wasn't as focused on back then was attention to detail, because it was in my head. I knew it. I don't need to like get it on paper. I don't need to like do all these iterations of something to like really make sure that it's perfect. Just wasn't natural in my personality. And, working for a job where you're producing information for other people and it's not about your understanding or yourself, he really quickly just started like ripping into me about my attention to detail. And like and I can attribute a lot of the success of the book to his training in that, because
And sorry, just for context there, Eric. So you're working as a management consultant, and your job is to
yeah,
supply information to someone that acts based on the information you supply. And if you supply something incorrect or factually wrong, or I don't know, just explain that a little bit more. Like
yeah,
basically,
totally.
don't fuck it up because it
Right.
matters. Is that what you're trying
Right.
to get across?
Yeah, exactly. So like when we're looking at a deal, right? One of the big things was, I did a lot of due diligence work for private equity firms. So if you're a private equity fund, you're looking to buy a company, and you hire advisors to help you do that. And like they would hire us when they're looking at buying companies that were kind of going through challenges.
Mm-hmm.
So they bring us on, and this private equity funds, they're going to go spend, say, $800 million to buy this company. So small details have very large implications when we're talking about that amount of money at that kind of
Mm-hmm.
scale. And and not only from that perspective, but you don't want to make your team look bad either. That's the other thing too. But so attention to detail is very important. So like they're going to go look at that company. I'm going to look at this company. I'm going to break down all the numbers of it. I'm going to look at its financials. We're going to come up with an analysis and say, here's what's good about the company. Here's what's bad about the company. And in every last detail of what you do matters. And if you don't, your reputation is eventually going to get hurt by that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd go through this. I'd like the numbers would be right, but I wouldn't format it correctly, or I wouldn't build it in a way that makes it easier for somebody else to understand, and like all these other things. And he was always like, no, like, you piece of shit, like you need to dig into this, man. And like, seriously, he would literally scream in my face sometimes. And I hated him when I first met him.
Yeah.
And cause he would scream at me.
But
and
here
then
you are
after a
talking about it
while,
a few years later with like genuine respect.
exactly,
In some ways. Yeah.
literally, it's always guys like that. It's the guys, most of the people that I feel like I've gravitated towards as mentors have actually been people who I did not like when I first met them, because they really pressed me on things.
And guess what, Eric? They probably didn't like you either.
Exactly. Yeah. It's exactly it. And but eventually, like, I realized I was like, wow, this guy really gives a shit. And he really cares about me. He's trying to make me better. And that's pretty much what it was. So he was, I got really, he made me deathly afraid of making mistakes. And I still have that fear today. So when I create things that I know I'm going to be distributing to other people that affect my reputation, I'm pretty afraid of being wrong about those things. So like when I'll go rewatch a podcast or something, and I'll be like, you misspoke about that number was off by this much. All these different things. I definitely have a fear of doing a lot of that stuff. And it's very valuable. And I can attribute a lot of the success of my book, of that type of attention to detail and perfectionism. I think that really forced me to, like, I went through tons of iterations of it over and over again. And because I really was just asking myself, what would this look like if the entire world was reading it? And what would people think? And of course you can't get to perfection, but I worked really hard on trying to get it to that point. And I think that from the feedback I've gotten so far, I can definitely say that it's that tendency was one of the main factors in the success of it.
And what I like, Eric, is that, well, something I've learned that's okay specifically through some experience I had angel investing in startups about 4 or 5 years ago. Um, Leveraging other people's work in order to make investments is totally and utterly allowed, which is not taught in school. Like in school, it's like if you cheat by copying someone's work, you're in trouble. And it's
Right.
a skill that, in a sense, is self-taught. You go, through the experience of sitting next to someone who knows what they're doing. They want to put their money into that startup for lots of reasons that I don't understand per se, but they're more experienced, have had success in the past, and therefore they're the smart money and they understand what they're doing. It's actually therefore relatively safer to make a bet alongside someone like that than it is just on your own trying to make it up yourself. So when I hear you explain what you just did, basically having been through extremely rigorous analytical school, basically, you're being paid for your time to analyze someone else's decisions for them. You cannot get it wrong. Therefore, your level of skill in that department is very high, and most people wouldn't have that. And therefore, to write a book about Bitcoin that analyzes it with that same lens and come out with a positive review of it, yes, there are some threats, but this is a game changer. You need to listen to this. That's actually something that I, as a Bitcoiner, can read and go, okay, this is interesting. I'm now even more convinced that this is a good idea. And I think that's the kind of characteristic that I find so interesting is everyone has different lenses, right? You sat down 10 years ago, like, right, I want to get into private equity. How do I do that? And you self-taught yourself through university, because university, in my experience anyway, is basically a whole lot of content that you basically have to teach yourself and then regurgitate in an exam to get the piece of paper to then get into the job that you thought you wanted. And, it's all this big kind of stepping stone process. But that's very cool to hear you explain that. Well, shout out to that previous boss of yours that forced you to think like that, because that's obviously a skill set that you'll take on forever, right? Every time you now think about writing or creating a report or advising someone, you have in the back of your mind, I cannot get this wrong because my reputation gets suffered long term, and it's kind of a process of thinking. What I'd like to draw toward next is, you sat down, you sold your property, you moved in with your mum. It wasn't part of the plan, right? You think back to your college days
Right.
and what the plan was. Can you dig into a bit more as like why you thought that was the right thing to do? What did you feel at the time? And out of that has come a book, which, to use a Bitcoin phrase, is as good a piece of proof of work as you can ask for, right? Here's a bloke that basically no one knew anything about, who sat in his mum's house and wrote a fucking book. And it's actually brilliant because look at his background and why his analytical skills are actually very relevant to this. What do you think it was inside you that just made you take that step? Like, oh, mum, I'm
Oh,
moving in.
yeah. Um, I, you know, I had a very large shift in my perspective on life.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say from the age of like 24 to 25. And I think that I got to a point where I realized that I wasn't happy doing what I was doing, and I realized how much of a priority that needed to be. And I'm somebody who's never been very good at noticing those kind of things in myself. So, I would always set like a goal or a mission, and I would go towards it. I don't think about how I felt about it or anything. I would just say I'm going to go towards it. And I think it was kind of getting towards my mid-20s I started to actually consider emotions, because they're more of a emotions are a very strong feedback mechanism. They allow us to calibrate towards what we're genuinely interested in. And I think that like when I got to that shift, I just it kind of dawned on me that I didn't feel very purposeful at all in what I was doing. And that's what made me feel pretty unhappy about what I was currently doing. And then that's what started, this huge search for purpose. And I think that for me to really get comfortable with a lot of that, it was more just I think at a very personal level, I kind of got to a point in life where I just didn't really care about a lot of the things that I used to care about. At some point when I was younger, I wanted to be somebody who was important, who drove a nice car that people looked up to, and had a big house and an attractive wife and all these things. That was something that when I was, much more arrogant and younger in college, I was definitely, had in the back of my mind all the time. And, And then I got older and I kind of realized that I just didn't really care about any of those things. And then I said, okay, well, you don't care about those outcomes, but like, what about the job itself? And I was like, yeah, I guess, it wasn't that I hated it or anything. That's not the point I want to get across. There was a lot of things I really enjoyed about it. But it wasn't something that really I felt purpose in. And I think what really hit me, here's the funny part, because I hate saying this because there was a video that went big. I think it was sometime like a year or two ago. But I came to this conclusion independently, and then I saw it like 6 months or a year later pop up because Jeff Bezos was saying it. But I started to think really far into my future, and I started to think about what I'd be proud of when I'm older. And I kind of got to this point where I'd be like, okay, well, I'm going to die one day. I'm not a very religious person, so like my framework of thinking is that when I die, everything goes black. And so a lot of people say that that's not a very motivating thing, but I think it's kind of been the complete opposite to me. And that also, that exact same point, that could have been a big motivator to me too when I was going into college, because I was right around the time as my freshman year of college that I really kind of came to terms with my idea on creationism and religion, and I did a lot of reading into all that stuff. But anyways, I think that, to me, I was like, okay, well, a lot of people think it's like, oh, well, what's your purpose if we're just going to die? And to me, it's just like to be alive right now, to do what you want to do while you're here. And that was something that just kind of, I was getting older, and I started to see that. And I was like, okay, like, this isn't it. What is it? And the last thing that really pushed me, so like once I got to that idea, it was Bezos. Going back, sorry, I skipped over, but like Jeff Bezos was in some sort of interview that I ended up seeing later on, and he's talking about his like regret minimization framework for life. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly what it is. When you're making really hard, scary decisions, I think if you go from the framework of saying, what am I not going to regret in the future? And I told myself, I don't love what I'm doing now, so obviously I want to do something else. And I think if I don't do this and I, cling to safety and I, am restrained by my fears, that I will, that'll be something I deeply regret at some point in the future. And I felt regret in my life. And that's a feeling that I don't want to feel again. That's probably the worst emotion I think anybody could feel, because it drains on you and it stays with you. And so that made me really think seriously about it. And I was like, you know what? No, this is something I need to do. And then what got me comfortable with like finally taking the final leap, I think was, I kind of got to a point in life where I like really like loved myself enough to where I was okay with the idea. I was like, you know what, if you take this leap and and it all goes to shit and like, you blow it. I got comfortable with the idea. I was like, you know what, I'd actually be fine taking some sort of, middle income job that gives me a good lifestyle where I can be healthy and have good relationships with people in my life, and have good friends and have honest conversation. I got really comfortable with that idea. I was like, you know what? I could fall back into something like that. I mean, technically I could fall back into my career if I actually wanted to, but at that point I really just didn't even want to go back into that world. And I got comfortable with the idea of like worst case scenario, like I'd be happy saying I tried and, just going through life, and still you always got good friends. You can always laugh. You can always, have experiences with people. Like life's pretty good regardless. And then once I had that thought, I was like, yeah, let's fuck it. Let's do it.
Fuck it, let's do it. It's a great phrase.
Yeah.
I also like, what would my 60-year-old self say? So just imagine yourself as a 60-year-old and go,
Yeah.
well, and often when you're thinking about should I, shouldn't I, you know which one it is. Like it's much more obvious because actually as a 60-year-old, you want to make sure that, you took every opportunity that was there. You live by every instinct or hunch that you had and you just went for it. And the final part of that being is like this concept of making failure your friend. Well, yeah, it sucks failing. Of course it does. Like it's a horrible process, but through that, people obviously learn so much more perhaps than even the small successes they might gain from these. This is the theory, right? I mean, I've tried to found businesses before that didn't work. I'm trying to like live that as a concept. And that's basically the kind of the moment that you had is what you're explaining. It's like, actually, if this fails, who cares? And really the summary of it as well is, and I definitely had this, so I'm 5 years older than you, so not much at all really, but I remember very clearly as a 28-year-old thinking like, is this it in the job I was working in at the time? And I resigned. I'd met my now wife. We went traveling and I took a different route and I enjoyed all that process.
Nice.
And funny enough, I'm now back in that same industry because all the startups that I tried didn't work. So I've had to go back in a sense, just for now. And I don't regret any of that. And it was that kind of thing of going, all right, do you know what? I've just got to scratch this itch. And, your resignation goes in, and it's one of the most exciting days you've ever had. You're like, oh my God. And you spent like 5 years of your life working your nuts off to get to the position that you were in. And most people would have thought you were crazy. Like, what do you mean? What do you mean you're resigning? You mad? And you're like, no, I'm fine. Thanks. And yeah, it's a very cool story, Eric. I love it. So now just to turn a bit more towards the future. Thank you so much for sharing all of this with me. You don't have to mention necessarily the details of the project that you're worked in, but that you're building. But what's the future have in store for Mr. Eric Yakes?
Yeah. I think, I'm still, I still don't even totally know. I think the way, okay, so this was a big adjustment for me coming from the guy who planned his whole career path, for this decade long period. When I first went into the whole entrepreneurship side of things, I felt very, very uncomfortable. And that was one of the big issues for me, which is a good and a bad thing. But I learned, I think, over like the first year of doing that rather than trying to structure and plan everything, maintaining a core set of principles that you hold on to, and taking advantage of opportunities as they come, and having conversations with people that are interesting to you. And if I kind of kept doing those things, a lot of good has come from that. And I think I just kind of want to keep doing that. So I have some sort of plan. I don't really know what it is. Like, I have a very tiny Twitter following right now. But I have some sort of plan. I don't know if it's like a podcast or some sort of media or whatever. I'm going to do something in that direction at some point. I really like you and I having this conversation right now. Love doing this. This is so much fun, especially
fun,
like,
isn't it?
And you're a great interviewer because you can really deep and have like the personal questions. And like, I think that this is a great area for you.
Thank you.
You're doing a really good job. And like, I enjoy doing that too. And I like having real conversations with people. I like talking about philosophical things. Like, I think similar to like your bent, probably something in that direction too, but I don't even know what it is yet. And kind of like how the book just was obvious to me when I started writing it. I was like, oh, there's a void in the industry. You need to do this anyways. You'll learn. It's not going to hurt you. Like, do that. Kind of waiting for something like that to pop up in that direction. But I don't really know what it is yet. I just want to have like really meaningful conversations with people. I want people to learn from things that I say, and I want to learn from other people too. And I want to make jokes and laugh and do all that good stuff too. And like, just find a way to really do all the stuff that you enjoy normally in life, and in a way that, people enjoy as well. So that's definitely part of it. But one thing I kind of realized going into this, and this was something that I wasn't really certain of, as I wasn't certain of a lot of things when I was first starting down this path. But I was like, okay, well, do you want to just do like a media thing, or do you want to set up a business too? And like, there's a lot of skills I've gained on the business side of things that is something I also really enjoy. I enjoy strategizing. I enjoy understanding markets. I enjoy understanding how different technologies work. I enjoy working with people. I enjoy leading teams. All that stuff I really love. And so I was like trying to figure out a way to make this all work. And really quickly after I wrote the book, I was like, okay, well, once I wrote the book, I was just looking at the industry. I was like, wow, there are so many companies that need to be built, and there's so much different software that needs to be built. Right. Mm-hmm. There is just opportunities freaking everywhere. It's not, the ideas aren't the issue, And so I spent like 6 months really trying to refine what I thought about the industry. And at first I was thinking like, okay, like financial services, some sort of software, not exactly, but something similar like what Swan or like River or those guys are doing. I saw a lot of value in doing that. And I thought that, with the new wave in the industry, kind of like the high net worth market's not really addressed right now very well. So that could be a potentially good area to go into. And that's how I was first thinking. And then when I kind of got deeper into some of that and I started talking to different people and throwing ideas around with my mentors, the regulatory environment's pretty scary on that side of things. And I didn't really want to get into the game of playing all that. And now what I'm doing now is still needs to consider the regulatory environment, but it's not nearly to the same degree. I mean, I really respect what like River's doing. They're spending like they're raising all this money and spending all this upfront capital to get money transmission licenses in like every state, and that's like so expensive to do, and there's a lot of uncertainty around that, how that could change. So it's pretty badass. But that scared me off from that market a bit. And I tried to think, look, for really what I wanted to provide for people, more on the asset management side is probably a better way of doing it. And so it's really kind of getting into that area and, going after some of those markets. But really, it's just like the way I see it is I'm looking at it from the perspective, I'm starting a company that is something that I know is needed right now. But my plan for the long term isn't necessarily just that. There's so many different ways you can go. It's just like an open playing field in this industry right now. And my plan for the long term is, to really have everything I'm doing overlap as much as it possibly can. So I'm talking about the social media side of things, talking about a separate business. I want that to overlap a lot. And sorry, I kind of got off topic. The one thing that I realized too, when I was, deciding, okay, I want to do both of these things, was that one of the problems you see with people who are just doing media is that eventually you have to sell something. And I kind of just never really wanted to do that. I kind of want to just actually build a platform. I think like, from my perspective, I think like one of the most valuable things that you can get out of having some sort of following or having a media presence is trust. I think that's more important than generating money. And like, if you have a way to make money, then you can, focus the whole media thing on just generating trust. And I think that like, that's the most valuable currency when it comes to
and actually, Eric, if I could jump in there, that gets right to the root issue that I think we see in a lot of mainstream media. I have a friend here in Australia. He works for one of the big broadcasting companies. And he's explained to me the dynamics. He actually works in the advertising team. So one of the leading supermarkets here is his biggest customer, and they pay him to advertise on their channel. And the news desk is supposedly not affected by the advertising relationship. And they supposedly have complete autonomy to do stories as they want. And let's say a story comes out in which this supermarket is talking about underpaying staff, or they haven't done overtime correctly, or some kind of negative twist. And more recently, it's been about these ridiculous vaccination mandates. You can go into a store unvaccinated and buy something, but you can't work there. And there's this big legal disputes going on in Australia about this stuff at the moment. Point being, the news desk is supposedly autonomous to the advertising desk, but that's just absolute bullshit, because who's the customer for that broadcasting company? The customer is the supermarket. They are paying the bills, not the punters at home watching the free to view news channel. So even though they say that that's the case, it's bollocks, right? It can't possibly be true that they actually send out every story that they hear that's negative about said customer. So to your point,
exactly,
I genuinely agree. And this actually comes around to a wider subject that I'm actually writing an article about at the moment. But like, financing ideas has changed forever, because you can, let's say I say to you, right, Eric, let's start a media business together. We're going to finance it with one Bitcoin. Okay. In 4 years' time, much like Peter McCormack's real Bedford concept, you've got a deflationary asset on the balance sheet that might 10x from today. You don't need sponsors. You don't need advertising revenue from the supermarket to go out and have a team of journalists or a team of people creating media content. The financing model is just basically changing right in front of us right now. And as you say, there's opportunities everywhere. Sorry to slightly hijack that, but I'm passionate about it as well.
Not at all, man. No, I completely,
It's a great insight. It's like, okay, could I, effectively you're saying, can I somehow finance my media ambitions, or, my potential to educate people for free with another business model or whatever that might be able to do that? It's a great shout. I think it's possible. Of course it is. Yeah.
It's not as much like, finance would be the right word, but it's more like, if you, something I've always found is that people who I think are really exceptional in certain areas are typically people who are doing a lot of different things. And there's, because the overlap from the two areas has like, is incredibly synergistic.
Mm.
Um, and like Elon Musk would be the perfect example of that. You know, he does all of these different things. He's in all of these different areas and all these different creative ideas that have emerged through like the businesses he's built over the years. And it's people like that. Like, you know, something my dad used to always say growing up is, you know, you want to play multiple sports. You don't want to just play one sport. And you end up
Mm.
being better at both sports if you play multiple sports, because a lot of what you learn in one sport transitions over to the other. And the people who are singularly focused on one thing, they don't get that. And as long as there's a lot of overlap between the areas, obviously, but I think it's really important to be doing a bunch of different things that you care about and finding ways for it to all sync up. And that's exactly it. So like I think the best media businesses are ones where you don't need to make money off of them. And
Mm.
that really allows you to have the comfort to be able to say, you know what, I'm going to say what I want to say. And it's more about just like being honest with the world, and whether or not you like me or you disagree with me, you still trust me because you know I'm not going to lie to you. And
Mm.
like, and that's kind of what I would really care about the most. And then having something else and being involved in another area that also you're learning about a lot of the things that are going to be valuable to the people you're creating media for. That's another great thing. But the whole idea of like, when it gets into media, the whole idea of like selling and stuff, to your point, like there's a conflict of interest between, you know, the consumers of the content, the publishers of the content, and then the financiers of the content. And
Correct.
like that's the whole issue with the social media model.
Yeah.
And that's what people are trying to like solve from like the decentralization perspective and make it
Yeah.
like a more user financed model. And hopefully we get there on some of that, because like that makes a lot more sense. It's like if you do like the whole idea of getting like a super follow on Twitter, it's like I probably will never do that, but like it makes a lot more sense. It's like if your followers actually want to pay you for
Yeah.
something more access or something, like yeah, that makes a lot more sense. I mean, you're
Yeah.
still going to be saying the same things. But at the end of the day, like you know, you do think about it. And I was like talking to my mom about this at one point. She was like, "So you wouldn't want anybody to like sponsor you?" I was like, "Oh, well, like stuff that I really like, you know, I cook barbecue on a big green egg all the time." I was like,
Yeah.
"They want to sponsor me, like that'd be cool. I love green
Yeah.
egg, like."
Yeah, and that's
But
the problem
yeah,
as well.
it's
So we're all like slightly biased, right? You know, we'll be like,
right,
"Oh, that's
exactly,
a cool brand." That even though I'm not supposed to think like this, it has actually like coerced me over time. And even when I'm looking at the
right,
Real Bedford shirt, like Casa and Compass Mining that I mentioned, Gemini, you know, have I done
yeah,
any business with any of those companies? I've never used them as a user, no. But like weirdly, I kind of like the name because I've, you know, learned so much from Peter McCormack's
right,
podcast, and you know, before you know it, you're buying a certain type of trainer, or like, you know, I wear glasses, so like a branded glasses or whatever. um
right,
and actually it's the same friend that works at this broadcasting company, shout out to Belly if he ever listens, um who said the best form of advertising is when people don't know they're being sold to. And you think,
right.
okay, and that's where it's all, you know, it's very difficult to decipher what's going on in the world. So Eric, I'd love to just touch on quickly, I'm intrigued. So when I was working as a startup founder, I got through a couple of effectively elite programs, but they're called talent investment programs, and they put 100 people in a room together. They pay them to go. There's 50% technical, 50% non-technical, and we've got 8 weeks to come up with $1 billion idea with someone with complementary skill sets. And if they like it, they'll then put 100 grand into the idea. You've then got 12 months of runway, and they've got a whole
Yep,
network of VCs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's been a very successful kind of iteration of the VC model in recent years. The process that they taught us was a very rigorous customer discovery process. So if you're going to solve a problem for someone, you need to know that that problem is extremely acute and they're going to pay you for it. And solving a
hmm,
problem that isn't really, really, really bad is actually not going to generate enough traction and enough money in the short term to justify a developer team, et cetera, et cetera. At least that's the
right,
theory. Um, in your experience of the last, let's say, 18 months since you released the book, you've obviously got a very
yep.
business-minded mindset. Um, where are the biggest problems in the Bitcoin space? And this is where opportunity abounds, right? Because you're just like, hang on, that doesn't work properly, that doesn't work properly, that doesn't work properly. All of these products exist elsewhere, whether they be insurance, whether they be stock markets, whether they be, you know, leverage, whatever, that actually aren't that easy on a Bitcoin standard today. whereas they might be in
Right.
5-10 years time. So yeah, has anything been like particularly stand out to you that you think are interesting problems that drastically need solving?
Certainly. I think that the way it's a huge question. So I'm thinking about how I should frame it. Um, I think I'll start with the first thing that was very, very apparent to me, and there's other things, that a lot of other people focus on in terms of like user experience and applications and all of that. That's obviously, there's tons of opportunity there, because until my grandma can use Bitcoin without knowing it, that's not there yet. And but the first thing that really popped out to me was on the financial side. Like, my vision for all of this is, if Bitcoin is going to be this base layer form of money, then we're need payment systems on top of that, and we need applications that utilize those payment systems, and Lightning and Strike. So like that's getting built out, and that's huge, because once we have a base layer money for settlement, and once we have a networked out, a whole expanded network of payment systems that are actually being adopted, that's when this thing's endless. And so that's where we're at right now. But financial systems are much more complicated than that. So you have base layer money, you have payment systems, then you have a whole ecosystem of financial products and services that exist on top of that help people move value across time, space, and scales in a bunch of different ways for a bunch of different reasons. So we have, debt, we have lending, we have borrowing, we have insurance, we have a bunch of different types of securities that are used in different ways. Some of those are standardized. Some of those are securities that are being, traded in public markets. Other things are just contracts that are being structured by different service providers for specific reasons. And there's this massive ecosystem, and like those are huge, huge markets, and all of that needs to be replicated on top of Bitcoin. So where I see this industry going is we have the payment layer set up, and then eventually we're going to have, we see like side chains like Liquid, where they're issuing debt on it now. So that's probably like our first big example of, securities. But eventually we're going to have stock markets, and we're going to have, debt contracts, and we're going to have indices, and all these different things are going to exist purely within this ecosystem on these new payment rails. Now, those are like the products side of things. For those products to exist, there's going to be, applications and software that's going to be innovative, I think, in these areas, and make that all pretty streamlined. And that's what like a lot of these altcoin ecosystems are attempting to do. And like, staying away from like that side of the debate. The point is that whether it's a centralized service provider, or whether it's, a decentralized provider that's lying about whether or not it's actually centralized, or whether we do get to a point where we can actually find meaningful ways to have some degree of decentralization in certain forms of software to facilitate that. I don't really know the answers to all that yet. But I do think that it's going to be a spectrum of different service providers that are providing different things to different areas. And I think what's going to be really, really valuable are companies that can really bridge the gap well, because we're kind of at this adolescent stage, and we're awkward. Like our legs are long, our arms are long, but like our shoulders aren't wide yet. We can't really run that fast. And, there's all these things that are building out disproportionately. So you need service providers, I think, that are still can bridge the gap between moving people from the traditional financial world into the new digital world. And so you want to be playing both sides of the field for a period of time, and you can help people with the adoption. You can hold their hands, and you can bring them into the new ecosystem. And then you can also, while you're getting people involved in the industry with like traditional infrastructure, you can take that and invest that organic revenue into building out different infrastructure that is going to be supporting them as a service provider in this new ecosystem. So I think like when you talk about things like asset management, I think that's going to be a huge innovative area. So, providers who are totally specialized in asset management within this ecosystem and know how it works, and know where their risks are, and know how to structure their product offerings so that they can support people purely within this ecosystem. That's pretty much where I ended up getting really focused on. And that's what I'm working on right now. And I think that there's going to be a world where, at the end of the day, I think I just wrote a piece on this. It's going to go in like the actual Bitcoin magazine, their next magazine, the printed version that they send out. And I called it like the financialization of Bitcoin. And I think the big trade-off in this area that we're witnessing, and it's a big experiment that we need to figure out right now, is there's this there's this balance that is going to be found, or it's not. We're gonna find out. But there's a balance that needs to be found between self-sovereign ownership of Bitcoin without any financial service providers, and everybody being able to do that, and always having access to being able to do that, and then the necessary financialization of Bitcoin that's also going to occur. Because let's face it, in the future, you're not going to have a major company that's going to, have a guy who's the self-sovereign owner of their Bitcoin. You're going to have specialized service providers that do these things. So like institutions have very different interests than individuals. So like there's going to be financialization for those kind of things. If you think about like a high net worth client, these people aren't really focused on those things. And they're much more, they have people who manage pretty much everything in their life because their time is valuable. Think about like a highly successful doctor. I mean, who's somebody who's like invented a cure for something. They travel the world. They have time to do what they're really good at. They don't have time to worry about all this stuff. And maybe in 30 years, they'll be educated from, when they're 2 years old to learn how to do this stuff. So they will be able to, or it'll be automated enough to where they can actually depend on those things. But regardless, there's still going to be intermediaries in some form. Think of like multi-sig and having a third party hold your keys for you. Like there's a ton of different examples of how all these things can work out, but there's going to be a necessary financialization. And there's a lot of people, I think, who think that the world's just going to be like, everybody owns their own Bitcoin and everybody knows how to use it. And maybe that's true in a century. I don't really know, but for a very long time, it's not going to work like that. And so I think that there's this balance that needs to be struck, because what the risk of financialization is that people ultimately own Bitcoin, but they don't own actual Bitcoin. They own a security that entitles them to Bitcoin. And it was Ben Hunt of like Epsilon Theory wrote a great piece on this a year ago, Bitcoin TM, Bitcoin trademarked. And he refers to this concept. He's like, no, like Wall Street and, regulators, they're not going to attack it. They want to adopt it. They're going to get control over it, and they're going to wrap it into security, and they're going to sell you Bitcoin TM, and it's going to have, I think his quote was, all the same revolutionary potential of a bumper sticker. And I was like, and that's absolutely true. That's a really, really important point. So the point is, I think for the way that I see this industry is that we need to have a large proportion of Bitcoin that is self-sovereign. It needs to be a large proportion. It doesn't need to be 100%, but it needs to be enough of a proportion so that regulators and financial service providers are scared to ever screw people over. That's pretty much how it works. Because as long as people can always opt back into a self-sovereign system, then that takes the power away from everybody else.
Yeah, so the competitive edge keeps them in check, essentially, doesn't it? Yeah.
Exactly. It's a competitive edge that keeps them in check.
Rather than, oops, sorry guys, can't pay the bills, just going to print a shitload of money.
Exactly.
It's like the complete opposite end of the scale, isn't it? Yeah,
exactly.
Nice.
Yeah. And so I think the question is what proportion is that? And I don't have an answer to what that is, but I think it's actually a lot smaller. My guess would be it's a lot smaller than what people think. I'd assume if, say the world had, say 30% of its assets in like a self-sovereign form, that's a huge chunk of wealth. So if shit hits the fan in the financial world, people are going to have a lot of wealth, and they can, opt out of these service providers pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So it's going to be some sort of balance between these two things that needs to occur. And then the key ingredient for all of that is going to be at the application level, which I'm not smart enough to speak to, but the application level where people can find ways to have these financial services and be self-sovereign. So like I'm involved in like the beta for Atomic Finance, and
I was going to mention them. Yeah.
They're a great example of that. And I am hoping that at some point in the next couple of years that I can get their technology involved with what I'm doing for my company, which kind of brings me all the way back to my point. I think that financial service providers, if like you're somebody listening and you're a financial plan to be a financial service provider in this industry, I think a key thing that needs to happen is that for whatever you're doing, you need to be educating people on self-sovereignty, and you need to be finding ways to support their self-sovereignty. And it is a little bit of an altruistic thing, right? But if you could structure your company in a way that provides you incentives to make them self-sovereign, I think that that's really beneficial to the ecosystem in the long term. And in me getting into the financial side of things and being well aware of how, the industry that I'll be part of is something that can really take away from the ethos of Bitcoin, I want to make sure that I'm doing things to counteract that. And yeah, that's kind of how I view it.
Well, it's Wow, it's a lovely conversation. I'm loving it. The opportunities are endless, and where it's going to take us,
Endless.
we don't know. But I guess just to draw back to one of the comments I made, we're teaching ourselves, right? We will work it out.
Yep.
And that's just the nature of humans. We're posed a challenge here. There's a system that's clearly disintegrating on itself, and we've got a new opportunity to build something else. And with that comes entrepreneurship, and with that becomes, capital requirements, and with that becomes the potential to, improve customers' lives, to improve people's, standard of living, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, it's very, very exciting. Eric, listen, an hour and a half has flown by. Thank you so much for your time. The last comments, yeah, anything to wrap up you want to mention, and where can people get hold of you if they want to get in touch?
Yeah, dude, this was an awesome conversation. I totally enjoyed it, and I think like the bent and focusing on like background and all that stuff, I think it's really enjoyable, and I definitely think it's something that people don't focus enough on. Something that I've always been gravitated towards, and yeah, it was an awesome conversation. And anything I want to say is just. I don't have all the time in the world, so it's always hard, but I always encourage people. People reach out to me on Twitter a lot, and I'll end up meeting some great people from doing that, having great conversations. Like if anything I say really impacts you in some sort of way and you want to reach out, like please reach out. I love meeting new people. I try to be as open and communicate with as many people as I possibly can. But for particularly people who are like really genuinely interested in stuff that I've said, that typically leads to like really cool relationships. So like, please reach out. I'm on Twitter at Eric ERICYAKES, and yeah, that's it.
Well, and I'll post that in the show notes as well. Well, Eric, thank you so much for joining today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jake. It was a blast.
Pleasure.